Many of us in our formal years rarely questioned the function of school because the end goal seemed obvious and universal. An education meant access to a better job, higher income, a house, and a family to fill it with. Yet today, with 130 million Americans reading below a sixth grade level, a declining birth rate, and an unemployment rate gradually increasing, and men bailing out of university at record numbers, it has begun to feel like the American dream sold us all a bill of goods. More so, when billions of taxpayer dollars are vested in foreign affairs instead of confronting the most obvious problem facing the country, we're left with one conclusion to draw. Our leaders don't care to reform the education system because it is working exactly as intended. Knowing that rotten ideas can take decades to corrode an entire institution, it's only right we travel back in time to discover the true agenda behind our modern education. Sheldon Richman, a research fellow at the Independent Institute, cited that between 1800 and 1840, literacy in the North rose from 75% to between 91 and 97%. In the South, the rate grew from about 55% to 81%. But there's more to this than simply proving that the United States was a nation of readers. Before 1852, when Massachusetts became the first state to pass a compulsory law requiring children ages 8 to 14 to attend school, education was private and decentralized. Since the government had no say in what was to be taught, classical education such as the study of Greek, Latin, history, and science were common throughout the country. However, a nation of scholars and critical thinkers became a nuisance to monopolists who needed a generation of obedient employees. In steps John D. Rockefeller, who donated $180 million, a whopping $6.2 billion today, to create the General Education Board. With the aid of his close friend and advisor Frederick Taylor Gates, Rockefeller would implement Gates's vision for public school in his book, Country School of Tomorrow. In it, he expressed a vision of a highly controlled and standardized educational system where the goal was to produce a compliant workforce, not nurture thinkers or talented individuals. Rather, Gates advocated for a system that molded people to fit specific, predetermined roles within society, neglecting scholarly cultivation and artistic pursuits in favor of basic vocational training. Gates and Rockefeller did not work at this alone. It'd be negligent to forget John Dewey, the purported architect of the public education system. In the 1920s, Dewey visited the Soviet Union and came back to the United States inspired by their collectivist mentality. He was no communist in a violent revolutionary sense like Karl Marx or Vladimir Lenin, but held socialist ideas for radical changes in education that intersected with the interest of Rockefeller and Gates. He too did not believe that higher education should be a target that students aspire for, but that it should be the process of coming to share in the same social consciousness. Make no mistake, social reengineering was the primary goal of public education as soon as Rockefeller, Gates, and Dewey took hold of it. But they would not complete their objective until they destroyed two obstacles opposing them: history and religion. George Orwell said in 1984 that he who controls the past controls the future. Rockefeller figured this out before Orwell published his novel in 1949 and teamed up with Andrew Carnegie, a man who made his fortune in the steel industry from building railroads and transporting Rockefeller Standard Oil. In 1905, he established the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, while Rockefeller followed suit in 1913 by establishing the Rockefeller Foundation. It wouldn't be long before these two men would cooperate on their shared desire to transform education, not just in the United States, but in the entire world. We know this because in the 1950s, the Reese Committee, a congressional investigation formed for the purpose of unveiling the activities of these two tax-free foundations, was granted access to the Carnegie Endowment's board minutes. Norman Dodd, the director of research of the Reese Committee, explained that Carnegie suggested that the portion of the education system which could be considered domestic be handled by Rockefeller, while the one that is international be handled by his endowment. Knowing that the key to the success of these operations lay in the teaching of American history, they approached four of the most prominent history teachers and suggested that they alter the way they teach it. After they were denied, they decided to build their own stable of historians and approached the Guggenheim Foundation, which specialized in academic fellowships. Their proposal to Guggenheim was when they found young men in the process of studying for doctorates in the field of American history and felt that they were of the right caliber, the Guggenheim Foundation would grant them teaching fellowships. After he agreed, they assembled 20 potential teachers of American history, and these men eventually became known as the American Historical Association. As history was rewritten, these men simultaneously attacked religion. Dewey, with Rockefeller's support, brought Marxists from Germany's Frankfurt School to the United States. The Communist International Party's goal was to dismantle Christian culture and spread cultural Marxism throughout the institutions. Funded by Rockefeller, Dewey imported these radicals to Columbia University, from where they spread to other institutions, eventually reaching the University of California. These professors and their ideological heirs are responsible for critical race theory and for labeling strong fathers and husbands as authoritarian figures to be eliminated. Some might say this sounds conspiratorial. However, the deracination of Christian values in the United States started before the early 20th century. Orestes Brownson, an American activist and preacher in the early 1800s who became Catholic after he repented of his involvement, blew the whistle on a sacred organization called the New England Transcendentalist. His words, "The great object was to get rid of Christianity and convert our churches into halls of science. The plan was not to make open attacks on religion, but to establish a system of state from which all religion was to be excluded." Everything comes together when we recognize that since organized prayer was banned in schools in 1962, Christianity has been steadily replaced by pseudo-religions that expand government power. In part, we can trace the centralization of education and the push to turn citizens away from God to communists like Dewey and monopolists like Carnegie and Rockefeller. However, one man, seemingly even more sinister, gave their corrupt system its name. In 2003, John Taylor Gatto, an American school teacher, wrote an essay called Against School, critiquing Alexander Inglis's 6 basic functions of education. The duties of these functions were written by Inglis in his 1918 book, which he called The Principles of Secondary Education. There's no documented evidence of any association with Rockefeller or Carnegie, as there's suspiciously very little information about his life in general, but his vision for education sums up the ideas they all shared for handicapping future generations. The 6 functions of public school. First, the adjustive function. Schools are to establish fixed habits of reaction to authority. Inglis knew that people have a proclivity when given sensible orders to follow them. However, he knew the only way to properly determine if students have developed reflexive obedience is if, when given stupid orders, they automatically followed those too. And so, to remove critical thinking from someone's mental framework, it's crucial to force them to adopt rules and principles that make zero sense. Number 2, the conformity function. Its intention is to make children as alike as possible. People who conform are much more predictable, and if you want to continue exercising control well after they leave school, they need to think the same as their peers. Number 3, the directive function. School is meant to diagnose a child's proper social role, then log the evidence of where they are in the grade pyramid. If students learn at an early age to assign themselves a particular category of intelligence, then it'll be much more difficult for them to escape that compartment as they age. Number 4, the differentiating function. Once each child has been diagnosed into their prospective layer, they must not be allowed to learn anything that the higher layers are learning. This explains why public schools today separate the gifted children from the non-gifted children, when in actuality both classes of kids are being indoctrinated just by different learning material. Number 5, the selective function. This refers to Darwin's theory of natural selection, applied to what he called the favored races. In short, schools should prevent the poorest of kids from breeding by tagging them with labels of inferiority, such as poor grades, remedial placement, and humiliation, so that their peers accept them as inferior. With low self-esteem, the females would reject them as possible partners. And lastly, the propedeutic function. The structure dictated by these rules calls upon a select group of overseers. To achieve this, a small subset of students will be discreetly trained to sustain the system, learning to supervise and control a population intentionally kept docile and uninformed. Ultimately, this creates a cycle where students who advance to higher education, having been miseducated themselves, go on to spread that same misinformation to the broader public. We must remember that many public school teachers are not purposely carrying out these actions, but with little say in the curriculum, they're often pressured to conform to federal mandates that serve progressive political agendas. To make matters worse, universities have become the gateway to the elite classes, shaping the selection of future leaders based on ideology rather than merit. Reflecting the concept of collective consciousness from Inglis and Dewey, Those who aspire to prestigious positions are often expected to either comply with or actively participate in the indoctrination of the masses. This indoctrination typically involves, but is not limited to, blurring the lines between what is objectively right and wrong, fostering unwavering trust in government entities, and promoting prevailing liberal ideologies to secure support for the Democratic Party. As bleak as this may seem, there is a silver lining. The communists and robber barons of the late 19th and early 20th century understood that a nation's culture shapes every facet of its existence. Its language, history, and religious beliefs form the very foundation upon which the state is built. As large corporations and academia have aggressively imposed a hollow atheistic agenda, they've stripped our culture of its depth, but dug their own graves in the process. This has allowed room for the responsible right to build new academic, artistic, and cultural institutions in God's name and return to valuing the religious and communal ties that kept state intervention at bay. If we commit to this multi-generational project now, with time, we'll reconnect the meaningful aspects of America's past with a vision that offers our offspring true purpose, identity, and renewal.